O.G. Rose, and today we're going to be talking about belonging again, section 28. One of the questions I've always been interested in is, why does history repeat? Now, I understand that history doesn't exactly repeat and that there are massive paradigm shifts in information technologies, and I know Mr. Barr does not like the idea that history repeats, but I think it depends on what you mean. I think there are certainly patterns to history. I think there are ways that when we say history repeats and we talk about human nature, I think we're talking about probability. Why is it the case that the majority of times, if humans are in a situation where they can't get access to food, they become violent? Are we saying that every given human, when they run out of food, becomes violent for, if it's, say, long enough of a period of time without food? No. That's not what we're saying. We're not saying this is determinism, but we are talking about probability, and there seems to be certain patterns of, say, economic activity. If the Federal Reserve keeps interest rates low for X period of time, there tends to be Y amount of speculation, and that causes a market collapse or something like that. None of this ever occurs in the exact same way, and there are always differences, but there seems to be interesting repetition. History, if we don't believe history repeats, we could say it rhymes, at least, as some people will put it. But there does seem to be patterns that civilizations fall into, that societies fall into. You have those famous paintings, I can't remember the name of the painter, on the start, rise, fall, decline of civilizations. And we all do have this general sense. I mean, even Ray Dalio recently put out some videos on the rise and fall of empires in terms of economics. And so there is this kind of sense that there's something cyclical about history, even if it is not a hard deterministic cycle. And we have to be careful to say that, to talk about history as if it's some sort of determined course. I do think history is quite contingent. But no, we get this notion from Hegel that the future is better than the past, or there is no future. So there's a contingency to Hegel. But there is this interesting sense that civilizations go through these periods, they go through these cycles. And that's always been an extreme interest of mine. And the reason I find it so interesting is no civilization plans to decline. Every civilization plans to be smarter than the last. In the same way that, say, my grandmother, my father also said it, but they once said that, nobody gets married planning to get divorced. And I found this remarkable because it's so obvious, but it's critical, because no one thinks they're going to get divorced, and yet they do. So what are they not taking into consideration? What are they not thinking about that catches them off guard? Or is there something structured into marriage that is traumatic and unexpected? And I think this does get us into, say, Lacan or Zapunctia on what is sex, on where in marriage you encounter the lack of human beings, the fundamental incompleteness, and the real, as Lacan will talk about. And that can be very traumatic, especially if you're not ready for it, if you've had no experience ahead of time. And it's the nature of marriage to bring this out. It doesn't matter if it's with your favorite person in the world or least favorite person in the world. There is something about the experience of humans regularly that leads to an encounter of the real that can be quote-unquote traumatic. So there's arguably something structural about marriage that catches people off guard. But we can, no one plans to invest in the stock market and lose all their money. Nobody plans to get a job that makes them unhappy. So it's this very interesting kind of dynamic where we get caught off guard. We end up in situations where we genuinely think we're not going to end up in. So how does that work? If you're getting married, you must think that you understand how divorce occurs to some degree, and therefore you think you know how to avoid it. But surely the people who did get divorced thought something similar, or a lot of them did, and yet they still got caught off guard. So you get this kind of meta thing where you think about X, but thinking about X, you think about X, and then you think about Y according to X, and then you think about Z, and this long chain of cause and effect. But somewhere along the line, one loses track of the cause and effect, maybe, or they go down the wrong path and they get caught off guard. And that's always fascinated me. I guess we can think about that in game theory dynamics. But anyway, the question to me of why does history repeat, if we just take that question on face value, is similar to why do people get divorced, why do people lose their money in the stock market or something, and we can keep going. Why do people get a job that ultimately makes them unhappy when the whole idea of getting the job, say, is to open doors or to start careers or to progress, to advance. And I'm always interested in that because it gets into game theory, it gets into structural questions and stuff of that nature. This brings us to section 28 of belonging again, where we were explaining the last section how there's this very interesting dynamic where givens are what make belonging possible, but givens also oppress. And therefore justice would have people oppose those givens for the sake of having extended to them the sense of home and belonging that those givens provide. But if they oppose the givens, then they can get rid of that very thing they seek. And it's almost a cruel joke, and it's structurally cruel and ironic, if you will. The section will make points regarding minorities in America. Say black Americans that walk into a room and wonder what people are thinking about them. They might be the only black American in that room, and they know that. And we've learned from Berger and Hunter and Reif and others that when you don't have social support, that can be existentially overwhelming. Well, a minority, a black American arguably doesn't have social support much at all. They're very familiar with that situation. I mean, in some respects, we can view a whole lot of this language of givens and relations in terms of minority versus majority, in that givens are more majority, releases are more minority. And what we're talking about, the loss of givens, is a state where increasingly more and more people feel like minorities. And that's not to say that's bad, but it's to say that it's more existential, more psychological, and that can be more difficult for people. They're not familiar with it. And we were also noting, if minorities in America, black Americans want givens to be released or reduced or deconstructed so that they can be extended some degree of existential stability, white Americans may freak out. White Americans, in say having majority privilege or givens for a long time, are not familiar, generally speaking, with as much existential instability and uncertainty, and so they're habituated to existential stability and become fragile, and they become fragile. And so the collapse of givens can cause them to be existentially overwhelmed and turn to authoritarianism. And we were saying in the last section, where there's it's almost like a suicide pact. It's almost like a mechanism of self-destruct, where the majority goes, hey, if you release givens, there's gonna be an authoritarian backlash. And minorities, say black Americans, can be kind of look at that and be like, we're just asking you to have a little bit of existential instability that, being a minority, we have to face and deal with all the time. But literally the majority of the majority could be in a place where they are so fragile existentially and psychologically that they can't even handle that little bit. So then it's kind of like a suicide pact. It's kind of like, if you start to remove givens, we're going to backlash against you, and it's kind of a threat. And there's something cruel, there's something horrible about that. There's something horrible about that. And yet, following probability theory, even if it's horrible, it could still be the case that in all probability, if you start to remove givens, the majority is going to give you an authoritarian backlash. If someone listening to this, if you're a white American, imagine if you've ever traveled. One time I was teaching English in Sichuan province, in Guanyuan near Chengdu, 4 hours outside of Chengdu, I think. And you might be the only white person a lot of these natives have ever seen, these Chinese natives have ever seen, especially in far western China, where it's more rural. And there can be a kind of funny existential feeling about that, knowing that you're the only white person around. And now that existential instability is a glimpse into what it's like to be a minority. And I think, now, again, we're not saying that's the only thing minorities, say black Americans, have to deal with, but it's an insight into the existential feeling that members of a minority have to deal with, and that it's very exhausting. It is very psychologically difficult to deal with. And I think we can see majority privilege in terms of existential stability. In America, that would be white privilege, and I'm just using the term majority privilege because I think when we're talking sociologically, we're talking about structures that could apply to different nations. In America, it can have more of a racial description to it. But this issue of majority privilege could exist in many civilizations. Say if you're in the Middle East, where the majority of people are Muslim, if you were Buddhist or Hindu or Christian, your religion would not be given, and so that would lead to existential instabilities. So in America, generally speaking, we can say that whites have majority privilege, and as givens are deconstructed, majority privilege well, the majority privilege is weakened and there can be a backlash. And arguably, one of the greatest, strongest aspects of majority privilege is the privilege to claim that if givens are weakened, there's going to be an authoritarian backlash, which has been the argument of this paper, that is what occurs as you reduce givens. And that, in of itself, that very argument has a privilege to it, and yet it can nevertheless be true, which is terrible. And who in the world would accept that argument? Who in the world, how could you consider yourself moral or just if someone came up to you and said, well, we have to, we have to maintain givens because if we don't, there's going to be an authoritarian backlash and those givens oppress minorities. How could you possibly accept that argument? How could you possibly and morally not oppose the givens? And yet it could absolutely be the case that what we just described could pan out. It's just probable you're going to have that authoritarian backlash. The other thing that can occur is because we're not, it's a different subject, but since we're not really trained emotionally, we don't have much emotional intelligence as a society, we are trained to think that freedom feels good, that increased freedom feels good, and also that the right choice feels good. And so as givens are reduced, which actually increases freedom for more people and increases justice, it can actually feel bad because freedom and justice can feel bad because it can feel existentially destabilizing. Well, then we can conclude from that emotional feeling that it's the wrong course of action and therefore oppose the minorities who might be deconstructing the givens in the sake of justice. And then they, once they are opposed, can be justified to oppose that opposition, and then it goes back and forth, and we start to see why history repeats, what is integrated into the structure of society that causes this. One of the key reasons why minorities can oppose givens is precisely because they want to feel like they belong. They want to feel like the nation and the society is their home. It is theirs. But here's the kicker. That feeling of home and belonging is possible because of the givens. It is that very existential stability, that very calm, that very rest of which is the feeling of home that givens make possible, and yet those givens are what oppress and make people feel not at home. This is kind of the cruel irony, the structural horror. What oppresses is also what makes possible home. And so if you have minorities opposing givens precisely because they want to feel at home, if they deconstruct those givens, then the very possibility of feeling at home can be lost. The very effort to have home extended to more people what can make it be the case that there's no feeling of home for anyone. And yet minorities are ethically justified, justice is on their side, to oppose those givens. The section is going to describe there being a circle of acceptance, where inside the circle you can feel accepted, you can feel at rest, you can feel at home. And the idea is that everyone outside the circle feels excluded, and it's wrong for people to be so excluded, and so they are justified to try to enter the circle. But to enter the circle, they have to break it open. And if the circle is broken open, it vanishes. And then no one can feel belonging and no one can feel at home. Again, this is a cruel and terrible description. What does this mean? Well, it can start to suggest and hint at why societies have this structural tendency toward ascent and decline, why societies can fall apart. Because the very thing that makes societies feel like a place people want to be in can also be simultaneously what causes oppression. But does this mean that then the best society would be one where there's no givens at all, where there would therefore be no exclusion? Well, that would be a society that's arguably not even a society. Does this mean that everyone needs to become like Deleuzian individuals or something non-rational? So should people stop trying to make the world make sense and instead learn to live with more senselessness? As Daniel Frege put it quite recently on his book, Ontological Design, and I think Ontological Design that Mr. Frege put out recently perfectly overlays with many of the concerns of belonging again. Mr. Frege suggests that you're entering into a world where nothing is given, where nothing is solid, where the essential human nature is no longer present, so we have to learn to be creative and design ourselves. Well, that sounds like the most just society, because if givens inherently exclude and are inherently unjust, then the most just society would be one where everyone engages in their own ontological design. They become beings of absolute knowing, we can talk about, or Nietzschean overmen, anti-fragile. I think all those things go together. But of course, here's the great dilemma. What if something like this, a world where everyone engages and participates in ontological design, or the making of their own essence, or becoming beings of absolute knowing, what if it's practically impossible for the majority to achieve this? What if it will always be a minority of people who can be delusional individuals, or who can handle the burden of ontological design? What if that's always inherently a minority of people who are able to do that? Well, then we have a problem. So what are we saying? What are we saying is the answer? I mean, we're saying that society, what we are doing is describing that society might be inherently tragic. And humans might tragically need society. We're not God. Aristotle said if you don't need society, you're either a god or an animal. And we're certainly not gods, and if we desire to be animals, our desires are unfulfilled. We might be like some of the characters in Kafka, as I talked about with Pei, who want to be animals, but if you have the idea of wanting to be an animal, it's already too late because you have an idea. Yeah, so what is the answer? What are we saying? Well, the concern is to figure out why history repeats, why society engages in these cycles, and that is an answer why we might be starting to glimpse. For more by O.G. Rose, please visit ogrose.com. You can find a playlist of the whole Belonging Again on YouTube. You can find a list of all the sections on Medium, and thank you so much for your time.